Bom dia a todos. Meu nome é Leonardo Nemer Caldeira Brant. Eu presido o Centro de Direito Internacional com sede em Belo Horizonte. É com muita alegria que eu saúdo a todos os presentes, saúdo igualmente os professores internacionais e nacionais que irão estar conosco durante essas 2 semanas, durante o 16º curso de Direito Internacional. Eu gostaria de dizer que, em primeiro lugar, esse curso foi todo desenhado num novo modelo online. Nós já estamos aí no 16º curso desse gênero. Ele foi totalmente adaptado às novas circunstâncias, o que, de certa forma, permitiu também uma extensão do número de participantes, de professores internacionais e nacionais participantes. Temos este ano 19 grandes nomes do direito internacional que estarão presentes conosco durante essas 2 semanas. Num primeiro momento, portanto, eu gostaria de agradecer a todos os professores que colaboraram conosco, que estarão conosco nesse período, com palestras muito interessantes sobre temas dos mais variados do direito internacional. A todos eles, o meu muito obrigado. Em segundo lugar, saúdo e agradeço também aos alunos, aos estudantes que estão participando neste período de julho, conosco durante essas 2 semanas. O nosso também muito obrigado. Esse é um curso que envolve uma grande equipe do Centro de Direito Internacional, a qual eu tenho o imenso orgulho de colaborar e de presidir. Ele é um curso que pretende trazer para o Brasil e para a nossa América Latina o mesmo modelo de cursos que, de forma quase centenária, já é uma tradição nos países europeus e nas principais universidades do mundo. Portanto, para nós uma grande satisfação que tenhamos ele já há mais de uma década no Brasil. O curso de inverno de Direito Internacional, com toda a sua abrangência e extensão, não seria possível de ser realizado igualmente se não fosse a relevante parceria e a confiança e o apoio da Fundação Konrad Adenauer no Brasil. A ela estendo um caloroso agradecimento e tenho a certeza de que estamos contribuindo juntos para os valores do direito internacional, para os valores dos direitos humanos, para os valores do Estado Democrático de Direito, para os valores da democracia e, com certeza, para a compreensão e construção de um mundo, de um universo internacional mais justo e mais equilibrado. Portanto, agradeço de forma calorosa ao apoio da Fundação Konrad Adenauer no Brasil. Gostaria, portanto, de dar início ao 16º curso de inverno de Direito Internacional, esperando que todos tenhamos 2 semanas de muitas atividades e aprendizado. Um forte abraço a todos. Okay, so again, well, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you all Professor Alain Pellet. As you must know, Professor Pellet is one of the most important thinkers of the structures of the international law nowadays. He is emeritus professor at the Nanterre Université in Paris. He is also a former member and the chairperson of the International Law Commission at the UN. He is at the moment president of the French Society for International Law. He is also designated to the panel of arbiters at the ICSID and to the list of the arbiters under the Annex 7 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. He is as well an elected member of the Institut de Droit International at Genève. Naturally, our law students are familiar with his course of international law, known as a masterpiece for international lawyer. So I am particularly honored and proud to moderate his conference because beside all his remarkable professional skills and qualities, Professor Pellet is also a good friend of mine and a good friend of Brazil as well. So, Professor Pellet, we are very welcome to our course of international law. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Please.
Thank you very much, Leo. It is a pleasure to be. With you again. As you say, we're good friends. I remember rather near time where you were my student and you wrote a very good thesis, which has been published both in French and in Portuguese, I think, on the res judicata. We will have some words about it now. And as you say, yes, Brazil is a country I really, which is very, very near to my heart. I must say for the moment, I have some disappointment with Brazil, if I may say so. The topic which has been given to me is a very wide one. I don't know if you had already some lectures or if it is the first one, but it is clearly a very wide one because the title is Crisis or Collapse of International Law. I can reassure you immediately it will not collapse. It will survive, although it must be accepted that times are extremely difficult for international law by now. I must say that I have devoted my professional life to international law for some 50 years now. And as much as I have heard that international law is in crisis, it has been said, it was in crisis, it has been said, in the second part of the 1960s, when I first became interested in international law. It was been at the time pushed by the new state that I emerged from decolonization. It was still said to be in crisis when in the second half of the 60s, when Prosper Weil published his famous pamphlet on relative normativity in international law, which is really one of the most commendable analysis of international law, although personally I do disagree with my former master, who was also my professor, who was his assistant, but we disagreed on everything, including on his fight against relative normativity, which I think is not an illness of international law, but probably a very good promise for future. But he said that international law was sick of its norms. This was at the threshold of the 1980s. After the ephemeral euphoria that followed the fall of the wall in the first half of the 90s, it was still said, the international was still said to be in crisis for other reasons. When the United States attacked Iraq, and less conjuncturally, I think, because of globalization, which was said to be at the origin of another crisis for public international law, at least. Certainly globalization imposed at the time a new reading of a new interpretation of international law as a whole. And in crisis, our international law is more so than ever today. With you have a choice. You can think of the systematic demolition of the post-war international law order by the American administration under Donald Trump. You can have in mind the dubious annexation of Crimea by Russia, the systematic disregard of United Nations resolutions by Israel, and its supporters. And now Israel plans to annex the occupied, all of the part or all of the occupied territory. You can have also in mind the refusal by several states, China and very various states, China, Colombia, Croatia, to respect arbitral awards. Even the United Kingdom do not comply with judgment of some judgment of the European Court of Justice, and Turkey, Russia quite usually don't, etc., etc. As the former vice president of the French Conseil d'État, Council of State, he was a very, very able, he is still a very, very able lawyer, Jean-Marc Sauvé, explained in a remarkable speech to the European Society for International Law, and I quote, "Our era seems to mark a double break. The crisis is no longer punctual or periodic. It has become permanent. It no longer enlightens us on the meaning of an evolution. It has become a source of indecision, disorder, and uncertainty as to its causes and effects, its diagnosis and remedies. Crises are no longer as evident as they used to be in the post-crisis horizon. This twofold rupture is undoubtedly due to a profound shaking of our conception of progress and of individual and collective identities. Today we are confronted with the vertigo of a crisis without end, without order, and without limits," end of quote. Exacerbated nationalism and assertion of sovereignty in its most absolute meaning, and I think it is a wrong meaning. Sovereignty is not the possibility to do whatever the state wants. But nevertheless, you have now this dominant view that because of their sovereignty, state can behave exactly as they want. And this is true both in the international order and within states themselves, where leaders flatter the nationalism of public opinion and lay the groundwork for populism. You have what we call now illiberalism, which flourishes, and not only in Brazil, but also within what the European Commission for Human Rights called in the past the free democracies of Europe, where we now have regimes which do not really care for the state of law. Dictatorships no longer have anything to fear from the condemnation by other states. The duty to intervene is long dead, and the more realistic and seemingly consensual responsibility to protect has, to say the least, lead in the wing. And while states are playing these dangerous games, the planet is dying, despite the increasingly anguished warnings of scientists and the irrefutable evidence of environmental degradation and its dramatic effects on climate, on biological diversity, on health, and ultimately, no doubt, on the very survival of humanity. Nothing stands in the way of the financial appetite of large corporations and hedge funds. And in the same vein, inequalities are increasing and would no doubt in the long term constitute a factor of instability, while autonomous groups that resorted to terrorist violence have emerged. This is, I think, terrorism is also a major another major phenomenon which is far from being curbed, despite a semblance of calm by the time being. At the strictly legal level, these disorders and threats have already made two obvious victims of very different nature, very different kinds. These victims of these multifaceted crisis are, I would say, human beings as a subject of law on the one hand, and on the other hand, the certainty and the effectiveness of the rule of law at the international level itself. With regard to the latter point, the certainty and the effectiveness of the rule of law, we can see with some concern that soft law norms are gradually invading the anti-field of international law. Although I have always been a strong supporter of soft law, as it is called, which facilitates compromises based on consensus, it is clear that the use of flexible rules is neither appropriate nor desirable in all situations. For example, there should be no procedural soft law, which is the case when you think of the very hypocritical procedural instructions adopted by the ICJ since 2001. But, well, I am a very frequent pleader before the ICJ, so I have this in mind. It is not that important. Less anecdotal is the inadequacy of soft law in the field of human rights, or more precisely for the protection of civil and political rights, because for their part, economic, social, and cultural rights, which are difficult to enforce strictly, are by necessity a privileged area for soft law. Now, this leads me to the second predictable victim of our era of recession in international law. When I speak of recession, I oppose it to progress. The human being, the human person, had willy-nilly made a spectacular breakthrough in the 20th century public international law, of which he or she, the human being, of which he or she had become a subject, a direct holder of rights and obligations under international law, thus piercing what is known as the state veil. And good humanist and optimistic minds, among which I tend to rank myself, if I am not a human rightist. This was a personal invention. I think I do appreciate and applaud human activists, but I think you must not make a confusion between human activism and the scientific approach of international for human rights. This is why I criticized human rightists, which is not an accepted word, although now in French it has become common. So people like me, and I see myself at least as a humanist, were enthusiastic about the legal advent of an international community whose interests transcends those of nation states for the benefits of the humanity as a whole. But today, although this is still only a creeping threat, there is a worrying risk of the dehumanization of international law. And there are already signs of these developments. For example, the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, are increasingly being challenged by states whose responsibility is recognized and which do not comply with the judgment. And again, concerning Europe, it's not only the case of Russia and Turkey, which are illiberal regimes, but it is also the case of the United Kingdom, who several times had refused to comply with judgment of the European Court. The cradle of democracy and human rights, states are withdrawing from the ICC, from the International Criminal Court, or are threatening to do so. No major new human rights conventions have been concluded since 2006, and many of the flagrant violations that recently, as recently as 10 or maybe 5 years ago, would have called for very strong reactions, now have elicited little more than rhetorical reactions or eloquent silence from the most clearly for the most democratic regimes. Another example of the questioning of the another example of this dehumanization is the questioning of the exclusion of the criminal responsibility of state leaders, as evidenced by the unjustifiable attitude of African countries towards Omar al-Bashir, the former president of Sudan, after the ICC issued an arrest warrant against him. But also, this is also the case for the debates of the Sixth Committee in the United Nations. The Sixth Committee is the legal committee of the General Assembly on the subject of immunities of heads of state during the consideration of the ILC's reports on this topic, where I think most states had a very very bad attitude, very bad reactions. It is true that the ICJ itself had encouraged and maybe provoked this regression concerning the impunity of head of states and high officials by one of its most regrettable judgments in the case of the arrest warrant, where it did not condemn the racist and genocidal calls of former Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the Congo, for the so-called Democratic Republic of Congo. But it is not only in the field of human rights that the recessive machine is at work. It is completely inconceivable today that treaties such the UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or the Marrakesh Accords, which completed the post-war World Economic Order in 1994 by establishing the WTO, the World Trade Organization, it is totally unthinkable that today equivalent treaties could be signed. Moreover, these instruments, the two instruments, the UNCLOS and the Marrakesh treaties, these instruments are precisely currently being flouted with impunity. The first by China in the South China Sea, the second, the WTO treaty, by the United States, which is succeeding in paralyzing the WTO dispute settlement system in a hardly insidious manner by illegally preventing the renewal of the membership of the appellate body. The appellate body is the body which settled settles dispute inside the WTO. Other examples are the difficulties encountered in implementing the Paris Climate Agreement, or the mistrust of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, which is nonetheless non-binding on its signatories, but which has been the subject of a terrible campaign which denigrates it with a lot of fake news. I am also thinking of the misadventures of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP, which was finally replaced by the Global and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CTTPP, which came into force at the end of 2018 without the participation of the United States. Similarly, the negotiations on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the United States and the European Union, the TTIP, are at a standstill, both because Mr. Trump has opened a trade dispute with the EU. He loves disputes with everybody in the world, with the EU, and because of the mistrust of the European public opinion, particularly with regard to the envisaged dispute settlement mechanism in this future treaty. For its part, the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, the CETA, appears to be in a somewhat better shape. It has been signed, but it is not free of controversy. It was signed in 2016. It was ratified by the European Parliament in 2017, but it has since been, and it has, it has since been provisionally applied, pending ratification by all EU member states, but the public opinion in Europe is very much defiant on the mechanism of settlement of dispute provided in the treaty. So, it is true that these broad free trade treaties are victims of the mistrust that manifests itself against globalization. The fact remains that, more generally speaking, the time for large and ambitious treaties has now probably passed. These anti-globalists, you might wonder why I have insisted on these rather particular treaties. It is because these anti-globalist episodes are, I think, particularly interesting. They show that the crisis is not limited to traditional aspects of international law, but the crisis also extends to transnational law, in the sense that in all the three cases, the CETA, the CTTPP, or the PCI, it is the aspects relating to international investments law and international trade law that are at the heart of the challenges. And this, I think, is very significant. It's not only the traditional public international law, but also these rather new fields of international law, which also are in crisis. This is also evidence in other evidence by other examples. Think, for example, of the brutal denunciation by the United States of the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, the INF Treaty with Russia, or the 1992 Open Sky Treaty, or the disastrous withdrawal by the United States from the UNESCO, from recently, but it will be only in force within 1 year, from the WHO or of the GCPOA. The GCPOA is this instrument which was signed to put an end to nuclear weapons in Iran, and which led to Iran's partial suspension of its own commitments concerning nuclear weapons. And more generally, it is of course exemplified by President Trump's mania for denouncing treaties binding on the United States that he doesn't like, and his systematic recourse to a policy of force without any regard for his country's commitments or for the rules of the rules governing countermeasures, which are trying to limit the use of force as a reprisal for non-compliance or supposed reaction for non-compliance by other states. Does all this sign the death warrants of international law? I do not think so. On the contrary, in a way, it can reinforce some kind of international law, not my preferred kind. Most of the threats hanging over international law are rooted in the exacerbation of sovereignty. But contrary to and I will probably be careful in what I will say. I will probably say something which you will see as being paradoxical. I think that contrary to an idea that is too widely held, sovereignty is not incompatible with the law. It makes law absolutely necessary. Let me explain. If without law, a single power is capable, sorry, just wait a minute, I'm coming back. I wanted to avoid unwelcome noises. So either you have to do with international law and to accept international law, or else a single power is capable of completely dominating the world. And then, yes, goodbye to international law in favor of a world state without any external counterweight or sovereign states. So this is one possibility. But the other one, which I think is more likely, is that sovereign states, equally sovereign states, continue to coexist, and unless they resort to war, but war is suicidal for humanity, if it is between great powers at least, a certain legal order is indispensable to ensure the coexistence of these equally sovereign states. Even if, as things stand, it may not be the international law which we have known since 1945 and which we could have thought had been reinforced and was strengthened with the end of the Cold War in the early 90s. But it will be international law. By contrast to what is the attitude of the United States, at least apparently, China has understood that the legal isolationism of the United States offers it a formidable opportunity to use multilateralism to its own advantage, as witnessed by the web China is waving with its One Belt, One Road, or a New Road of the Silk enterprise, the center of which is Beijing. And these show that indeed the law is the tool that can increase national influence at the international level. What the United States is losing, China is gaining, and it is gaining with basing itself on some kind of international, which is to its own advantage, contrary to what the Chinese keep on saying, but it is international. Rather than the absence of law, what is likely to emerge is what I would call a more inter-sovereign law, less multilateral, with a greater emphasis on raw power relations and reflecting the new power relations. The United States is weakened, but far from down, but is weakened for denying the less unjust order of which it had been, after the Second World War, the main founder and the main beneficiary, one must admit. But now the United States is trying to project its own law, not international, its own law beyond its borders, using as much as it can extraterritorial law. For its part, while posing itself as a defender of multilateralism, China is, as I said, waving its web, exalting the sovereignty of the state for the greatest benefits of its own, and the others, be it Russia or India or lesser but not less worrying, not less worrying lords, like Saudi Arabia or Iran. Should I include Brazil among them? All these states are trying to take advantage of the new Cold War by making their way between the two giants, who are more than ever practicing a somewhat, I would say, obscene clientelism. And Europe is once again divided, even if the EU, weakened by the Brexit, struggles to maintain a semblance of unity in the face of external political and even military threats and economic competition. And though paradoxically, the COVID-19 crisis seems to have boosted a better integration of the EU with the initiative, unforeseen but very welcome initiative taken by Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Macron. This does not promise, at least for the time being, the picture I have painted does not promise, at least for the time being, a bright future for the law of the international community. But perhaps this pessimistic statement, which reflects circumstantial impression at the time of this lecture, should be overcome. There are a few elements that give us, I would say, a glimmer of hope. Firstly, apart from the crisis of the WTO appellate body, judicial or arbitral dispute settlement mechanisms are now relatively prosperous. While the ICJ is not overwhelmed with cases, it is dealing with a far greater number of cases than any ever in the past. It is often complained that it is being used, that the court, the word court, is being used for political purposes. But this is a way of recognizing the weight of law in international relations. And I can testify from the inside, since I think I have been involved in nearly 65 cases now before the court, the ICJ. I can testify from inside that even if they have only limited illusions about the immediate effects that the court's decision may have in their cases, states nevertheless think that it helps them politically. My first case was Nicaragua versus the United States. We won. We won nothing financially, but it helped Nicaragua to survive as it was. Now it has fallen the bad side of politically democratic and corruption. It is the same. I am counsel for Iran against the United States and for Palestine against the United States for their embassy in Jerusalem. And these states do not think that their recent cases before the ICJ will change the picture, the picture completely. But at least they think that they may strengthen a bit David against Goliath, just as Nicaragua did more than now 35 years ago. Similarly, it is quite significant that Somalia, one of the poorest countries in the world and facing extreme problems in all respects, has brought its dispute with Kenya over the extension of their respective maritime zones before the ICJ. It means that a small state like that is confident that law in its hardest sense can help. And as discredited as commercial or investment arbitrations may be in some political circles, and even in the minds of some lawyers, these mechanisms remain more successful than ever, judging by the cases handled and the fees paid to lawyers and to law firms, which are not low, I can also testify. And it is not unimportant to note that China itself is beginning to respond, to use these mechanisms, commercial or investment, international mechanism for the settlement of disputes. Second, while there is little cause for optimism about the possibility of concluding new multilateral treaties in important areas, it is nevertheless interesting to note that despite the obstacles, draft comprehensive conventions on terrorism, on nuclear energy, continue to be discussed and seriously discussed. I don't know what are the real chance of them being signed, but are being discussed within the framework of the United Nations. And it is far from impossible that a convention on crimes against humanity will be negotiated on the basis of the 2019 draft articles of the International Law Commission. I have not the ILC in very high esteem, I must say. I have been there for 22 years, but at least this topic seems to be, crimes against humanity, seems to be a success and can be at the origin of a new important convention on human rights or international criminal law. Thus, even if we stick to a snapshot of the current situation without going so far as to say that the glass is half full, you will have seen that I am not very optimistic on the present situation. So without saying that the glass is even half full, we can at least consider that at least it is not completely empty. But if you now take a movie going back in time to the situation before 1945, or even more so before 1919, to compare this situation, the situation at that time or at these times, with the situation today, with today's situation, you will see that the situation leads itself to a greater optimism in view of the progress that has been made in a century. The prohibition, let me give some examples, we still have some time. The prohibition of the use of armed force has not prevented the persistence of many open conflicts since 1945. However, they have been limited, often within a single state. However atrocious they may be, whether in Syria, in Yemen, or in Sudan, not to mention the Yugoslav or Rwandan genocide. But a paper published in 2017 by the Oslo Peace Research Institute shows that the number of international conflicts has more than halved, so divided by two, since the end of the Second World War. It is, however, true that the number of non-international armed conflicts has increased more than the threefold, and they often involve significant external intervention. Nevertheless, keep in mind, in the positive side, the fact that international armed conflicts have clearly diminished, very significantly diminished. Independently of even the two world wars, the 20th century was a period of the worst humanitarian tragedies of all times. The Shoah, of course, but also the Gulag in the USSR, the so-called Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution in China, which were devastating in terms of human lives. But the 20th century was also the time when the world acquired legal instruments to deal with such disasters, at least when the political will and the balance of powers made it possible. What I mean is that the Security Council may now consider a humanitarian disaster as being a threat to the peace. And those responsible for the worst international crimes are no longer assured of impunity, even though they too often escape punishment. Nevertheless, you have now, why I don't have time to detail, and probably it's rather well known, but you have now quite a range of international criminal courts and tribunals. Another example, no state today, and for me it's a very important one, no state today can claim that the protection or disregard of human rights falls within its reserved domain or exclusive competence since 1945. And this remains true today. You might have heard about the Goebbels speech to the League of Nations. Goebbels was the Minister for Propaganda of Hitler. And I think it was in 1934, 5 something, maybe even 37, Goebbels made a speech, a very well-known speech, saying, what we do with our Jews, with our communists, with our pacifists is not your business. Mind your own business and let we do what we want with our Jews. This was following a complaint by a Jew called Franz Bernheims. And now such a speech is inconceivable. I think even the worst dictators could not say that, although I have in mind some speeches by Russian or Chinese, partly others, you may see whom I am thinking about, who say that international concern is is only a sovereign state concern. But nevertheless, I don't think that a global speech today is conceivable, even if too many states do torture in the secrecy of their prisons or their police stations. Another example, there is no international court with jurisdiction to settle all disputes between states. But while the word court has long remained the only such optional jurisdiction court, now we have what is called the proliferation. I would prefer to speak of multiplication, because you speak of proliferation of viruses, of rats, while multiplication is more positive. So I would speak of the multiplication of international tribunals and of international arbitration mechanisms now offers a wide and diverse range of possibilities for the legal settlement of international disputes. And again, it works rather well. It is limited impact, maybe, but it works well. And I would say long life forum shopping, which is sometimes criticized, but personally, I like forum shopping. I think it's better to go to any court or tribunal than to refuse to go to any. As the former president of the World Court, the Algerian Mohamed Bedjawi, he said this is a good chance for the settlement of dispute, and I agree. One can also put on the bright side of the scales the emergence of international criminal law and the deployment of universal jurisdiction, even though not that well, but it helps to consolidate the sense of the existence of an international community, even if much remains to be done, particularly with regard to crimes against terrorism, and the future of international criminal law seems highly uncertain. But it exists, and it was not the case before 1919 or 1945. And despite the irresponsible attitude of a few states, starting with the most powerful among them, the international community as a whole has finally taken the measure of the challenge, vital for our planet, of defending the environment. Only Mr. Trump or Mr. Bolsonaro have not this in mind. This vital challenge for the whole world of defending the environment. Concrete measures are still awaited, but the principle have now been established, and it is to be hoped that they will finally be implemented under the pressure of public opinions. So, viewed over a long period of time, the glass containing international law is not empty, and there is still hope that it will not turn into a dynamite barrel. But words are not enough, actions are needed. Just to conclude, law is not an end in itself. It is a means to ends that are external to it. Power and values, these are the real ends of law. When power relations turn to the detriment of values, of certain values, the legal norms that reflect these values weaken or disappear. It is undeniable that in the contemporary world, we are witnessing the rise of obscurantist forces with beliefs that are incompatible with traditional humanist values. But there is no magic wand, as my good friend Pascal Lamy, who stated when he took his office as the Director General of the World Tourism, of the World Trade Organization. So there is no magic wand. It is a balance of power that must be changed, not by incantatory proclamation of unforeseeable legal rules, but by taking steps, small steps first, taking steps to establish the conditions for change. To that end, I am convinced that the solution to the problem lies first of all at the internal level. There can be no gap between the values promoted at the international level by the international standards and those prevailing within states. If populist, illiberal, or frankly dictatorial nationalist and chauvinist doctrines continue to spread as they do today, it is hard to see how the erratic and regrettable trends in contemporary international law will be corrected. And we risk continuing to slide down the wrong slope of a return to pure interstatism. Ethical international lawyers will deplore this. They will have no choice but to acknowledge this sad trend. But lawyers are also citizens, and as such, perhaps more enlightened than other citizens. They can help to prevent this rather frightening development. I believe deeply in the virtues of political action, provided that, in line with the wise warning of Donald Tusk, not Donald Trump, Donald Tusk, the former president of the European Council, we keep in mind that, and I quote him, "We are not right just because we are right. Our reason must meet people's need." And I think that it is through the improvement of national policies that the international law in which we trust, in which we believe, will owe its salvation descent into hell. To quote the title of a thoughtful, provoking article by Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is an international lawyer in the US, and William Burke-White, and they wrote an article called "The Future of International Law is Domestic." This is because there is no basis for the international order if the internal order does not provide its foundation. Most of the tasks essential for the survival of humankind have to be performed within domestic contexts. It is, I think, therefore necessary to enable all the nations of the world to take care in a responsible manner, not only of their own matters proper, but also of those matters which affect the interest of the entire international community. And if I indulge once more in a small attack against the Brazilian ongoing administration, it is true that the Amazonia is Brazilian, but the protection of the Amazonian forest is a concern for the humanity as a whole. Now, a last word. I am often given the label of Sellian. Sellian, Georges Selle was a very well-known French international lawyer who said that there was no international order, that it was only an inter-individual order. On this, I do not really agree. And I hardly recognize myself in this doctrine, which for me rejects the observation of the facts. But this is not, this is no reason to adhere to the purely sovereignist or voluntarist doctrine that locks themselves into a sterile formalism and excommunicate the values of the legal sphere. As was written by Sir Harsh Lauterpacht, a very well-known and wonderful, I think, British lawyer who once was a judge in the ICJ, maybe even he presided it over. So he wrote, just as positivism in the domain of international law has become unscientific by being driven through its own exaggerations to disregard the very practice of states, which it professes to regard as the only source of law, so the desire of generations of international lawyers to confine their activity to a registration of the practice of states has discouraged any determined attempt at relating it to higher legal principle or to the conception of international law as a whole, as a law of the international community as a whole. This is an addition by me. The law, I would say, it cannot be limited to being a pure reducer of uncertainty. It is also, and I think it is part of the law as well as certainty, it is also a bearer of values, even if these values are only relative in time and space. Just like the philosopher or political scientist, the jurist can be a committed spectator, in the words of Raymond Aron, a French political scientist of the last century. In this respect, I fully assume my commitment while being aware of Martis Koskaniemi. He's a lawyer which I don't like as a lawyer. He's a very nice man, but a very debatable lawyer in my view. So I am fully aware of his warnings that commitment is identical neither with truth nor with faith. It always involves doubt, uncertainty about whether it is really warranted, whether it really provides a sufficiently stable practice and identity, end of quote. Although the present time may justify some discouragement, I still believe that lawyers have a role to play in averting disaster if they show not only rigor, but also courage and firmness in denouncing violations or regression of the law while remaining conscious of the primacy of politics. We must not do as if law was everything. It is only a son of politics. In trying to avoid both dry specializations and hasty generalizations, it is incumbent on international lawyers to strive to present the law as it is and to make it serve the cause defined by the founder of the United Nations, who declared their resolve. I think you know it, but we all must keep in mind what their resolve, what the people of the United Nations resolved in 1945, they resolved to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetimes has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human persons, in the equal dignity, equal rights of men and women and of nations, large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligation arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedoms. And I think that this remains a worthy ambitions. And concluding his 1933 general course at the Hague Academy, Georges Sell, the French lawyers I just cited some minutes ago, not all of which is certainly positions are not to be dismissed. Georges Sell wrote, "The horizons of international law today are very dark, but it is worth meditating on the words of William the Silent, and quote unquote, it is not necessary to hope in order to undertake, nor to succeed in order to persevere." In 1933, unfortunately, this was the necessary philosophy of the international lawyers. It is still in 2020. Thank you very much. I don't hear you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, my microphone was off. So thank you very, very much. Well, Professor Pellet showed us that there's actually no collapse of international law, but also a permanent crisis. And he described as well the difficulties of the international law nowadays. But balancing his view at the end of his position is, as I know, Professor Pellet is always an optimistic professor. I believe that. Yes, also believing in international law and its strain, and he followed the idea that the international law is now actually facing a huge challenge, but finally, international law is not empty. So he left at the end his message of hope in the role of international law in our international society. And I'm very glad, Professor. I think that we have no time for questions because we have a conference right now at 11 o'clock. So I'm very, very sorry. If it's possible, I will keep in mind some questions and I will separate some ones. And I think
we still have half an hour, haven't we?
No, I believe that we have another conference at 11 o'clock.
It was said that I had 1 hour to speech and half an hour for questions.
Yes, let me question just a moment, please, because I believe that I got a message here saying that we should finish now. Well, let's see.
Well, it was very clear. They said we start at 3.
Okay, that's okay. I will prepare some questions that students.
I am in your hands. I don't care, but I was really sad that we had half an hour.
Yes, it was my fault. I received that we still have.
I don't want to impose my view on your students.
No, that's okay. I received the message. So I got a question from. Let me see. Let me take one. Well, let me just from the beginning. Well, one from the Brazilian students. Professor Pellet, to what extent does Brazil anti-globalist stance contribute to the glass being half empty, especially in the realm of environment law? Is there still time for change in this scenario? I mean, your position about the
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can
yes,
you summarize
what's your
it?
position? Actually, what's your position about the Brazilian decisions in the field of environmental law now, in the Paris climate change, or do you have
Well,
some?
I'm afraid to be, you know how tough I am and how brutally frank I am. I'm afraid that Brazil is one of the worst pupil in the world class on climate change and preservation of biodiversity. So what I can read in the newspaper, in the news, or hear from the media, I am not at all optimistic with the ongoing administration of Brazil, which for me is just as bad as Trump's administration. And the same, I think you are, let me be totally frank, I think you are on the same slope as the US, thinking Brazil first makes Brazil less strong than it used to be. It was one of the big dragons, and now nobody really, it doesn't count. And why? Because it doesn't play the rules of the game.
Okay. Okay. So another one.
Not too tough, not too frank.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, that's your opinion. So, global governance born by the tension between the principles of sovereignty and international community. How to avoid this tension from weakening global governance today?
Well, that's a very interesting question, but I must say I have devoted my whole life as a scholar to try to understand and to popularize this dialectic between sovereignty, which I still think is at the heart of international law, and community values, which have progressed, not enough from my point of view, but which have clearly progressed during the last century. So I was, so for me, it's nearly a moving question. I cannot answer like that. I will just summarize. It happens that what I have, the lecture I have made is more or less a conclusion of the general course I gave in French. I gave in the Hague Academy in 2 years ago, in 2018. And also I have published a book some years ago, which is called Community and Sovereignty. But at the end of this conclusion of my general course in the Hague Academy, I say, well, I am not a very good theoretician. I know that there is something wrong with the combination of sovereignty and community, but it is not, you cannot say just community is over the state, the international community is over the state. It does not really help. You must find some other explanation, but I'm not good as a theoretician enough to solve this equation. And my last word in The Hague was to the new generation. I hope that some new groshers will emerge and will succeed in solving this this problematic. So I'm sorry for the one who asked the question. I have the same question, but unfortunately I don't have the answer.
Okay, we have another one from a friend, from a colleague here in Brazil. Well, dear Professor Pellet, could you please tell us your opinion about the future of the WTO?
Of the
of the WTO, I mean, the World Trade Organization?
Well, I am rather pessimistic. The WTO is supposed to be the third leg of the post-war international economic order, but it is quite different because the IMF or the World Bank, the IMF has a very strong, concrete role, just like the World Bank. It has some normative role, which the World Bank has not, but the WTO has a very weak normative role, no role at all as to aid, to assist states, but it was supposed to have quite a strong role in the settlement of dispute. It walked on two legs, but the normative was very difficult, and it did not happen. And the rounds, more time elapsed, less the round for negotiations in world trade were disappointing. While it seemed that the settlement of dispute by the appellate body would really be a success. And again, with the paralysis of the appellate body, because the US refuses to have new judges, new members of the appellate body appointed, it is in turn paralyzed. So honestly, I am pessimistic. As I said at the end of this lecture, I am very confident. I am sure that internal politics or internal values or international law is at the origin of the progress or recession of international law. We can hope that internally there will be changes in the internal policy, at least of the United States, and that it will bring some changes, including in their attitude to the WTO. The problem with the WTO is that the USA is not the only opponent. You have very big countries like India, maybe also China, although it is more ambiguous, who are not the good friends of the WTO. So the short answer to the question is, I am not optimistic, at least in the foreseeable future.
Okay. Well, there's another one. Well, how do you see the differences between human rights and human righticism? Human righticism, yes, you talk about it. So there's a question mark.
Well, I have been very much criticized for having invented this expression, human rightism, and it was such an invention that I made, on the invitation of Brazil, I made, what is the name of your, the member of the ILC?
Diana Suarez?
The lecture, I don't know.
Diana Suarez?
The name of the very well-known member, a Brazilian member of the ILC.
Diana Suarez or?
No, before.
Before.
Amado.
Gilberto Amado.
I don't.
Gilberto Amado. Gilberto Amado. Yes. There's a conference, Brazilian conference in there. Yes.
And you gave one later on the non-acceptance of the jurisdiction of the ICJ. So I was invited to give this very important lecture before the ILC, and I said, they asked me, what will be the title of your conference? And I said in French, I will speak of the droit de l'hommisme en droit international. And the interpreters did not understand what it was about. I said, well, in English it could be human rightism, which is something which did not exist. In French now it is very usual to speak of droit de l'hommisme, but it has become a very negative formula, which was not so in my mind. It was negative, but it was very precise. So when I speak of human rightism, I speak of these people who are professors, scholars, who instead of describing the law as it stands, describe it as they want it to be, full of human rights and insisting that all and every rules of human protection of human rights are jus cogens, peremptory norms of international law. And I think it is dishonest intellectually. It is not true. And I think that wishful thinking is very dangerous. I think there must be a very, for me, human rightism is positive as long as it belongs to human rights activists. It is negative if it is part of the human rights study. Human rights study must be objective, or not all human rights have been a success, have been really protected. And I think to do as if it was done is more dangerous than helpful. This is the reason why I make a big difference between human rightism and studying human rights. But I am a strong supporter of human rights activism, but not in the university, not from professors. I think it is a treachery.
Yeah. Well, there's another question. Well, Professor, what do you think about countries that use the argument of sovereignty to deny the receptions of refugees? Most of them link refugees with terrorism. So,
well, what I think is that it is an awfully difficult problem. In Europe, we have this enormous flux of refugees coming from Syria, coming from Africa, although the two fluxes, you can say flux in English? Yeah, maybe. Although these two flows are different, these two streams are different. From Syria, they are trying to escape war and the worst, one of the worst human rights or conflict raging now for a long period in the world. From Africa, they are more pushed by poverty. So these are different kinds of refugees. We don't say refugees because refugees are specific, as a specific meaning in law. Refugees are those which are protected by international refugees, while migrants are those who escape situations which are terrible for them, but which do not automatically permit them to be refugees. So first, there are refugees and migrants, and there are different kinds of migrants. Second, for the states, you cannot just have a straightforward answer by they are terrible and they are awful and I condemn them, or I just think that they are sovereign so they can do what they want. If you take Italy in Europe, Italy and Greece are the two states which are the most threatened, if I may say so, by migrants. And I think that it is humanly impossible to say to these Libyan, or they are not Libyan, they're African migrants coming from Libya, go back to Libya where you will be tortured or put into slavery. On the other hand, I think that you must have in mind the special burden on Italy, which is in a very bad shape economically speaking, with all these migrants. It's not a problem of having one or two or some hundreds or some thousand. It's really many thousands of migrants. And for Greece, which is the poorest country in the European Union, so there absolutely must be sharing of the burden between this first destination and the other states in Europe. I must say, I am not very enthusiastic about the French attitude on that. We are not the worst, but we are certainly not the good ones. But states like Hungary or the northern states are much worse than we are. But France is not very good. And you have seen also what happened with Mrs. Merkel. I think Mrs. Merkel left her heart speak some years ago, and they had 1,008 and several hundred million migrants on their territory. And honestly, it is a problem. So I have mixed feeling. I think the state cannot take shelter under their sovereignty, but I think state must accept that it is a collective responsibility, and you cannot just say because you have the others migrants on their territory, just they have to keep them. It is more complicated and difficult than one would think.
Thank you. Well, Professor Pellet, do you agree with Professor Wolfram that soft law forms a part of the hard law in the sense of filling the uncertainties and may not be separated from it? Could you please elaborate it?
Cannot be separated from what?
From the hard law. Well, if soft law,
surely.
Soft law should be included as a hard law or should be separated from this.
Yeah, surely. Like Prof, I am, as I said, a strong supporter of soft law. I think it helps. It helps the international society to see where it wants to go, to see the new trends, what is acceptable for everybody. It paves the way for hard law, this is true. But also, I think, again, it is not still a magic wand. And I think it would be also an error to say, well, after all, we have soft law, so we don't need hard law. I think it is very important not to put all our eggs on the soft law basket. Again, it is a first step, but it must not be taken as a last step. On some issues, probably soft law is better than hard law. But there is soft law and soft law. You have formal soft law, for example, recommendation of the General Assembly of the UN is formally soft law, since they are not, except very rare cases, they are not compulsory, they are not legally binding. Same for the gentlemen's agreements. While you also have what I call materially or substantially soft law. When you have a treaty saying, and it is unfortunately often the case in environmental matters, but in economic law you can find it as well. When you have treaties saying, states commit themselves to take all the possible steps to do something, to make their best efforts to do something. This is soft law as well. It is in a binding instrument, a treaty, but what is what is expected from the states, the parties, is very soft, very flexible. And I think that, again, it is impossible to say, but I'm sure that my good friend Rüdiger Wolfung doesn't mean that soft law is better than hard law. Sometimes it is better than nothing, but I would not go much further than that. Except that, as I said, I think during this lecture, in some fields, you can only have rather soft law. In cultural rights, you cannot have real hard laws, or it will be very limited.
Okay, so I think it's the last question, but well, Professor Pellet, how do you see the future of the ICC? Well, now facing the last decision of the Trump administration against the ICC. I mean.
Yeah, maybe we should explain what is the last step. The sanctioned not only the ICC as such, but also the judges and the staff. And it happens that one of my daughters is working.
Exactly. That's why. Yes,
is working in the ICC as an ICC staff, and they say not only the staff but also their families. So I wonder if I am forbidden to go to the United States now. In any case, I prefer not to go too much by the time being. This administration is so dreadful, but so it is, I think, awful. It's terrible, just to think that first it is really these sanctions, but also the whole boycott against the ICC by the United States, and it started before the Trump administration. But the big difference is the brutality of this administration, which is absolutely not comparable to the previous ones. But I think that punishing not only the institution as such, but people was absolutely nothing to do, no responsibility at all. They are just making their job, like the judges or the staff, is absolutely shameful. I think for me, and you know how tough I am, how frank I am, the Trump administration is just disgusting. And I campaign very hard against them, again, because internal law is just at the top, it's at the father of international law. And when you behave like you do internally with the Black Lives Matters movement, with the COVID-19, the way they deal with COVID-19, no matter human lives, but what is important is economy. I know some other countries who are like that. I think it is disgusting. For me, human life matter. So I think that, again, it is disgusting. What can we do as lawyers? Just say that again and again and again. It is unacceptable. And legally, it is incredible, because if I may just become again for 1 minute professor of law, because there I was a bit a politician, but I trust that sovereignty, and we go back to the very beginning of my speech, sovereignty is not an absolute right. It gives rights, but it also gives duties. And the fact that states like the USA, but it is also true for China and many others, wants to take all the rights and refuse the obligations, refuse the duties, I think shows that something is wrong on this planet. And this is quite recent. And it is not economic. The economy of the world is in a much better shape than it has ever been, except with COVID-19, which will be a catastrophe economically speaking, but a catastrophe of short time, I suppose, and I hope. But really, and the reason for that also is inequality. I think inequality between states. It has always been like that, and I have always been among those who are very sympathetic to small states and poor states, but also inequality between persons inside. And I think that you must also, it is this inequality inside which creates this populist movement and this trend to dictatorship. So again, you cannot separate what happens inside and outside.
So, Professor Pellet, thank you very, very much. We are very honored. And thank you for a conference. I hope to see you soon again.
Well, I hope it will not be virtual. I love Brazil in spite of its regime. So I love Brazil, and I hope that there will be possibility to be in person in Belo Horizonte. Bye-bye.
Oh, bye-bye. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.